August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Colonel Kianao Ichiki of the Special Naval Landing Force crouched behind a fallen palm tree, his Type 38 rifle steady in practiced hands. Through the dense jungle foliage he watched American Marines scrambling ashore at Red Beach with a mixture of confidence and contempt. For 2 years, Japanese forces had swept through every jungle they entered, crushing British forces in Malaya, overrunning Dutch defenders in the East Indies, and driving American troops through the Philippine jungles with seemingly effortless superiority. The jungle belonged to Japan. Every training manual said so. Every propaganda broadcast reinforced it. The Americans, soft from their comfortable cities, mechanized and dependent on luxuries, would wilt in the tropical heat like orchids torn from a greenhouse. What Ichiki didn't know, what none of the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal could have imagined, was that he was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would shatter every assumption about jungle warfare. Within 6 months, these same Marines he watched with disdain would turn the jungle from Japan's greatest advantage into their most terrifying prison. The Americans would learn to fight in ways that defied Japanese doctrine. They would adapt with speed that shocked their enemies. They would bring supplies in quantities that made Japanese logistics look like medieval warfare. And most devastating of all, they would prove that tenacity and determination were not uniquely Japanese virtues. The story of Guadalcanal is not just about a battle for an island. It's about the systematic demolition of a myth. The myth that Japanese soldiers were inherently superior jungle fighters, that their sparse logistics were a strength rather than a weakness, that American forces were too soft and too dependent on comfort to master the brutal reality of tropical warfare. By the time the last Japanese soldier evacuated from Guadalcanal in February 1943, that myth lay buried in the mud alongside thousands of bodies from both sides. The jungle that was supposed to be Japan's ally had become their graveyard, while Americans who had never seen a rainforest before Pearl Harbor emerged as masters of a new kind of warfare. The Japanese confidence in their jungle warfare superiority wasn't baseless arrogance. It was built on 2 years of stunning victories that had rewritten the map of the Pacific. When Japanese forces invaded Malaya in December 1941, British commanders confidently predicted the jungle would stop any advance. The dense rainforest, they believed, was impenetrable to modern armies. Japanese troops proved them catastrophically wrong. Using bicycles, light artillery, and aggressive infiltration tactics, the 25th Army under General Tomoyuki Yamashita advanced through terrain British planners had declared impassable. They moved through the jungle with practiced ease, traveling light, living on rice and fish, attacking from unexpected directions. Within 70 days, they had conquered the entire Malayan Peninsula and forced the surrender of Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress. The pattern repeated across Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, Japanese troops navigated dense jungle that American defenders thought would protect them. In Burma, British and Indian forces found themselves constantly outflanked by enemies who seemed to materialize from the forest itself. By mid-1942, Japanese doctrine on jungle warfare had hardened into unshakable certainty. Their training emphasized traveling light, each soldier carrying minimal supplies and living off the land when possible. They practiced moving silently through dense vegetation. They learned to construct concealed positions that were invisible until attackers stumbled directly onto them. Most importantly, they developed an offensive mindset that sought to psychologically dominate enemies through surprise attacks, night operations, and relentless aggression, regardless of casualties. When the Imperial Japanese Navy began constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal in July 1942, the small garrison of construction troops and their naval landing force protectors felt supremely confident. The island was covered in jungle that would favor Japanese defenders. Supply lines stretched back through the Solomon Chain to Rabaul, Japan's massive base on New Britain. Any American attempt to take the island would surely fail as their previous attacks had. The Americans, everyone knew, couldn't handle jungle warfare. They needed roads for their vehicles, depots for their excessive supplies, and constant reinforcement to maintain morale. The jungle would defeat them even if Japanese bullets didn't. The Marines who hit the beaches on August 7th came from a different tradition than the European-focused American military establishment. The Marine Corps had been refining amphibious warfare doctrine since the 1920s, studying every aspect of ship-to-shore movement. But jungle warfare was largely theoretical. Most of these young men had never been outside the United States. They had trained in the swamps of North Carolina and the forests of California, but nothing truly prepared them for Guadalcanal's oppressive reality. The heat was unlike anything they'd experienced. Within minutes of landing, uniforms were soaked through with sweat that never dried. The humidity made every breath feel like drowning. The jungle itself seemed designed to resist human movement. Triple canopy rainforest blocked out the sun, creating permanent twilight beneath the trees. Vines tangled equipment. Roots tripped running men. Insects swarmed constantly, biting through uniforms, crawling into eyes and ears. The first day seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions about American weakness. Marines struggled with the heat, some collapsing from heat stroke within hours. They hacked through vegetation with machetes, making noise that could be heard hundreds of yards away. They bunched up on jungle trails, perfect targets for ambush. They jumped at every sound, firing at shadows and wasting ammunition. Japanese observers watching from the hills could barely contain their contempt. These Americans fought like children, afraid of the dark, dependent on their officers, unable to function without constant radio contact with higher command. The professional Japanese soldiers, confident in their superiority, prepared to deliver the crushing blow that would drive these invaders back into the sea. But something unexpected was happening in those first chaotic days. The Marines were learning. More importantly, they were learning faster than any enemy the Japanese had faced before. When patrols got ambushed on jungle trails, they stopped using the trails. When Japanese snipers picked off officers marked by their different uniforms, the officers started dressing like enlisted men. When concentrated formations proved vulnerable, units dispersed and practiced fire and movement tactics that kept them from bunching up. The adaptation was systematic and rapid, driven by combat experience and an organizational culture that encouraged junior leaders to solve problems rather than wait for orders from above. The Battle of the Tenaru River on August 21st provided the first real test. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's regiment, 916 crack troops fresh from victories in the Pacific, attacked the marine perimeter with the confidence of soldiers who had never tasted defeat. They came at night, screaming battle cries, wielding bayonets, expecting to shatter American lines through sheer ferocity and courage. What they encountered instead was disciplined fire from Marines who held their positions and aimed their shots. The Americans had strung barbed wire, dug proper fighting holes, and coordinated interlocking fields of fire. When Japanese soldiers penetrated the perimeter, Marine reserves counterattacked immediately. At dawn, artillery and tanks that the Japanese hadn't expected completed the slaughter. Of the 916 men in Ichiki's assault force, 777 died on that jungle riverbank. The Marines lost 44 killed. The mathematical reality was brutal and undeniable. Japanese courage and jungle warfare skills had run into American firepower and logistics, and courage had lost. But the real lesson went deeper than casualty counts. The Marines had fought at night, something Japanese doctrine said Americans couldn't do. They had maintained unit cohesion under fierce attack, something Japanese propaganda said was impossible for individualistic Americans. They had killed without mercy when Japanese soldiers tried to fake surrender and then attack, learning the brutal rules of Pacific warfare in a single night. The survivors who staggered back to Japanese lines brought reports that contradicted everything their commanders believed. The Americans weren't soft. They didn't break under attack. They had more weapons than seemed possible. Every Marine seemed to have a semi-automatic rifle that fired as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. They had machine guns in quantities that Japanese units could only dream of. When they called for artillery support, it arrived within minutes. When they needed ammunition, seemingly endless supplies materialized from the beach. Worst of all, they were adapting to the jungle faster than Japanese doctrine said was possible. Within weeks, these same clumsy Americans were moving through the forest with growing confidence, learning to spot Japanese positions, mastering the art of jungle patrolling. The initial food situation revealed another axis of American learning. The first rations that came ashore were sea rations, heavy cans of stew and hash that required heating. In the jungle heat, with no way to build fires without attracting enemy attention, Marines often ate cold, congealed food that contributed to widespread dysentery. The cans were heavy, clanked when moving, and provided more food than soldiers could eat in the enervating heat. Japanese observers watching through binoculars noted these struggles with satisfaction. Americans couldn't even feed themselves properly in the jungle. But within weeks, Marine quartermasters had adapted. They began issuing a different mix of rations, crackers, chocolate, and compact foods that didn't require preparation. They distributed water purification tablets instead of relying on boiling. They established forward supply dumps that meant patrols didn't have to carry excessive food. The learning curve was steep, but American organizational culture rewarded solutions to problems rather than blind adherence to doctrine. Japanese supply lines, by contrast, were already beginning to fray in ways that would prove catastrophic. The Japanese logistics system was built on an assumption of quick victories and local foraging. Soldiers were expected to capture enemy supplies and supplement rations by fishing, gathering, and requisitioning from local populations. This system had worked brilliantly during the rapid advances through Southeast Asia. But Guadalcanal had no local population to exploit. The jungle provided little edible food beyond coconuts. And the Americans, rather than being overrun quickly, were digging in and preparing for a long campaign. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were on a ration of 600 grams of rice daily compared to the Americans' 4,000-calorie daily ration. And even that meager rice ration was increasingly difficult to deliver. The reason lay in American naval and air power that Japanese planners had underestimated. During daylight hours, American aircraft flying from Henderson Field, the very airstrip the Japanese had been building, dominated the seas around Guadalcanal. Japanese supply ships attempting to approach in daylight were bombed and sunk with regularity. This forced the Japanese into a desperate improvisation that came to be known as the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers would race down the Solomon chain at night, arriving after dark to quickly offload supplies and reinforcements before racing back north ahead of dawn. This system could deliver troops reasonably well, but was catastrophically inefficient for supplies. Destroyers couldn't carry the heavy equipment, artillery, or bulk supplies that sustained armies needed. And every trip risked these valuable warships in narrow waters where American submarines lurked. By September, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were on half rations. By October, rations had been cut again. Commanders who had confidently predicted quick victory now watched their men grow gaunt. The jungle that was supposed to feed them provided almost nothing. Coconuts could sustain life but not health. Tropical diseases, always present, grew worse, as malnutrition weakened immune systems. Malaria was endemic, with infection rates approaching 100% among troops who'd been on the island more than 2 months. Without adequate quinine supplies, which couldn't be delivered in sufficient quantity via destroyer runs, men burned with fever, shaking so hard they couldn't hold rifles, hallucinating in the jungle heat. Dysentery turned soldiers into walking skeletons. Dengue fever, scrub typhus, and a dozen other tropical diseases ravaged units. Japanese medical facilities, designed for quick campaigns, couldn't handle the sustained attrition of a months-long jungle struggle. The Americans faced the same diseases but with dramatically different results. Their supply ships, operating with relative freedom during daylight, brought quinine by the ton. Medical facilities on Guadalcanal, crude by stateside standards, were infinitely superior to Japanese field hospitals. Serious cases could be evacuated to rear area hospitals in Australia and New Caledonia, where they received treatment and returned to duty. American casualties from disease were high, but most recovered. Japanese soldiers, once they fell seriously ill, rarely returned to combat effectiveness. They simply wasted away in jungle hospitals or died at their positions, too weak to fight, but with nowhere to go. By November, combat effectiveness of Japanese units had collapsed not from battle losses, but from starvation and disease. A regiment that landed at full strength might have only 300 men capable of fighting within 6 weeks. The Marines, meanwhile, were mastering the jungle with systematic determination. They learned that Japanese positions were often invisible until you were on top of them, so they developed new reconnaissance techniques. Small patrols moved slowly and silently, stopping frequently to listen and observe. They learned to recognize slight changes in vegetation that indicated human presence. They discovered that Japanese soldiers, despite their jungle expertise, couldn't resist certain habits. They used trails which made them predictable. They often positioned their machine guns to cover trails, which meant attackers approaching from the sides could flank them. They built their fortifications facing expected avenues of approach, which meant they were vulnerable from unexpected directions. Every patrol brought back information that was systematically analyzed and shared. The adaptation extended to individual equipment. Marines quickly discarded the heavy entrenching tools they brought ashore, finding they were useless in jungle soil full of roots. They adopted machetes and learned to sharpen them properly. They discovered that standard combat boots rotted quickly in constant wetness, so they began wearing them without socks, letting them dry slightly each evening. They learned to pack differently, putting the most essential gear where it could be reached quickly. They figured out that cigarettes and letters from home were worth their weight in gold for morale, while many items they'd been issued were dead weight in the jungle. The organizational flexibility that allowed these adaptations was itself a weapon. Japanese soldiers were issued equipment and expected to make it work. American Marines were encouraged to find what worked and discard what didn't. The October offensive brought these lessons into sharp focus. General Masao Maruyama led 5,600 men in an ambitious plan to attack Henderson Field from the jungle-covered ridges to the south. The plan was classically Japanese: bold maneuver through supposedly impassable terrain, night attack to negate American firepower superiority, and reliance on fighting spirit to overcome material disadvantages. The approach march turned into a nightmare. The jungle that was supposed to favor Japanese movement proved nearly impenetrable. Units lost contact with each other in the darkness beneath the triple canopy. Soldiers carrying minimal rations, planning to capture American supplies after victory, began to starve when the quick triumph didn't materialize. Artillery that was supposed to support the attack couldn't be moved through the jungle. Supply bearers collapsed from exhaustion and malaria. When the attack finally came on the night of October the 24th, it was uncoordinated and desperate. Different Japanese units hit the American perimeter hours apart, allowing the defenders to shift forces to meet each threat. The Americans, by now experienced jungle fighters, held their positions with confidence born of previous victories. They had learned that Japanese night attacks followed predictable patterns. The screaming charges were designed to create panic, but Marines who'd been through it before simply aimed at the noise and fired. Japanese soldiers who reached American lines found not panicked flight, but close-quarters combat with Marines who'd learned to fight with rifle butt and bayonet when necessary. When dawn came, the ridges that would come to be known as Bloody Ridge were carpeted with Japanese dead. Maruyama's offensive had cost him 3,500 casualties for no gain. He retreated into the jungle with the survivors, who now faced the dual enemies of American patrols and starvation. The November naval battles completed the transformation. When the Japanese attempted to land major reinforcements and supplies via slower transport ships, American naval forces intercepted them in a series of ferocious night engagements. The Battle of Guadalcanal from November 12th to 15th saw the Imperial Japanese Navy lose 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transport ships. Those 11 transports contained food, ammunition, and heavy equipment that Japanese forces on the island desperately needed. Their destruction meant that Japanese soldiers would never again receive adequate supplies. The Tokyo Express could still bring in some reinforcements, but feeding and equipping an army through destroyer runs was impossible. Japanese soldiers watching from the beaches as their supply ships burned understood with sinking certainty that they were being abandoned to the jungle. By December, the situation for Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had become unsustainable. Units that had landed at regimental strength were reduced to a few hundred effectives. The rest were dead, too sick to fight, or had been evacuated as hopeless cases. Soldiers were surviving on 200 grams of rice daily when rice could be delivered at all. Some units received no rations for days at a time. Men foraged desperately in the jungle, eating anything that might provide calories. They boiled leaves, ate insects, killed, and ate anything that moved, including rats and lizards. Hunger became the dominant reality, overshadowing even the fear of American attacks. Japanese officers noted in diaries that their men no longer had the strength to dig proper fortifications. Attacks could be ordered, but couldn't be executed because soldiers lacked the physical capacity to move. Units simply dissolved as men wandered off individually to search for food, or died quietly at their positions. The Americans, by contrast, were receiving regular reinforcement and supply. In December, the 2nd Marine Division began replacing the exhausted 1st Marine Division, which had been on the island since August. Fresh troops rotated in while veterans who'd survived the brutal months were evacuated to Australia for rest and recovery. The rotation system meant that American combat power on the island actually increased over time, while Japanese strength inexorably declined. More importantly, the fresh Marines inherited the jungle warfare lessons learned by their predecessors. There was no learning curve reset, no period of adjustment. They stepped into a system that had figured out how to fight and win in the jungle, and they continued refining those lessons. The institutional learning was cumulative, with each generation of fighters building on what those before them had discovered. The final Japanese offensive in January 1943 was an act of desperation, born from orders that ignored reality on the ground. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding from Rabaul, ordered attacks to support a broader offensive in New Guinea. The soldiers on Guadalcanal knew the attacks were suicide. They had no strength, no supplies, no support. But orders were orders, and Japanese military culture didn't permit refusing commands from superior officers. On January 13th, remnants of multiple units attacked American positions west of Henderson Field. The assault was half-hearted, conducted by men who knew they were dying whether they attacked or not. Many Japanese soldiers were so weak they could barely walk, let alone mount a proper attack. Machine gunners couldn't keep their weapons steady. Officers couldn't control their units because radios no longer worked and soldiers were too dispersed in the jungle. The Americans, well fed and supplied, repulsed the attacks with almost casual efficiency. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal made by Imperial headquarters in late December acknowledged what everyone on the island already knew. The Americans had won. More precisely, American logistics and adaptability had won. Japanese fighting spirit, jungle warfare expertise, and tactical skill had proven insufficient against enemies who learned faster and fought with material superiority that couldn't be overcome. Between February 1st and 7th, destroyers of the Tokyo Express made their final runs, this time extracting rather than delivering. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese army and naval personnel who'd fought on Guadalcanal, only 10,652 were evacuated. The rest were dead, captured, or too sick to move. The exact death toll remains uncertain, but estimates range between 19,000 and 25,000 Japanese dead, with disease and starvation killing more than American weapons. American casualties were significant but sustainable. The Marines and Army soldiers who fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 7,100 killed and 7,700 wounded. But the larger story lay in adaptation rather than attrition. The American military that left Guadalcanal was fundamentally different from the one that had landed in August. They'd become expert jungle fighters through necessity and systematic learning. They'd developed doctrine for jungle patrolling, ambush tactics, night operations, and coordinated combined arms warfare in dense terrain. They'd learned to handle the diseases and hardships of tropical warfare without losing combat effectiveness. Most importantly, they'd shattered the myth of inherent Japanese superiority in jungle warfare. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal would be applied across the Pacific in the campaigns that followed. When Marines landed on Tarawa, they brought jungle warfare expertise from Guadalcanal. When Army divisions invaded New Guinea, they implemented tactics developed by Marines on that first contested island. The doctrine that emerged from Guadalcanal became the template for American jungle warfare throughout the Pacific Campaign. Fire superiority over maneuver, supply everything over living off the land, systematic adaptation over rigid doctrine, individual initiative over hierarchical control. These principles, proven in the Guadalcanal jungle, gave Americans decisive advantages in every subsequent jungle fight. For the Japanese military, Guadalcanal represented more than a tactical defeat. It revealed fundamental weaknesses in their approach to warfare that couldn't be corrected. Their logistics system, built for quick victories, couldn't sustain prolonged operations. Their emphasis on offensive spirit over material reality led to catastrophic casualties when enemies refused to break. Their doctrine, successful against colonial armies and Chinese forces in the 1930s, proved inadequate against a modern military power that combined material abundance with tactical flexibility. Most devastatingly, Guadalcanal proved that Japanese soldiers, for all their courage and training, could be starved into ineffectiveness. The jungle that was supposed to be their ally became their prison and eventually their grave. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was profound and lasting. Men who'd been taught that American troops were soft and incapable of jungle warfare had watched those same Americans master the environment with shocking speed. They'd seen material superiority that defied comprehension, endless supplies delivered even in the midst of combat, casualties evacuated and replaced, equipment functioning despite the jungle's destructive power. They'd experienced hunger that Japanese doctrine had said only affected weaker peoples, diseases that military training was supposed to transcend, and fear that honor was supposed to eliminate. The survivors who were evacuated carried with them the knowledge that everything they'd been taught about inherent Japanese superiority was a lie. That knowledge, spreading through the Japanese military via letters and personal contact, corroded morale more effectively than any American propaganda could have. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal carried away different lessons. They'd learned that they could fight and win in the worst conditions against enemies who'd been characterized as supermen. They discovered that American advantages in industry and logistics weren't just numbers on charts, but decisive factors in combat. They'd proven that democratic armies, despite the sneers of totalitarian opponents, could match and exceed the fighting spirit of any force on Earth. Most importantly, They demonstrated that adaptation and learning were themselves weapons as powerful as superior equipment. The institutional culture that encouraged junior leaders to find solutions, that rewarded innovation over adherence to doctrine, that allowed systematic learning from mistakes, had proven superior to rigid hierarchical systems that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. The broader strategic implications reverberated throughout the Pacific War. Guadalcanal was the first time in World War II that Japan had been forced into abandon conquered territory. It marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of a grinding defensive campaign that could only end in defeat. The Japanese Navy had lost cruisers, destroyers, and most critically pilots and aircrew in quantities they could never replace. The Imperial Army had lost an entire division plus supporting forces, not in glorious battle but in slow starvation and disease. The psychological blow was immense. Japanese forces that had thought themselves unbeatable had been beaten comprehensively. For America, Guadalcanal validated the strategic decision to fight offensively in the Pacific, despite the Germany First policy. It proved that American forces could take the fight to Japan rather than waiting for Japanese attacks. It demonstrated that American industrial might, properly applied, could overcome geographic disadvantages. Most importantly, it showed that American soldiers, despite coming from a comfortable society with no military tradition of jungle warfare, could learn to fight in any environment. The soft Americans that Japanese propaganda had mocked had proven themselves harder than the jungle that was supposed to defeat them. The legacy of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The campaign established patterns that would define the Pacific War. American forces would advance methodically, building up overwhelming logistics before major operations, accepting longer timelines to ensure proper supply. Japanese forces would fight desperately, often to the last man, but always with inadequate supplies and reinforcement. The jungle, rather than favoring defenders as Japanese doctrine assumed, would prove neutral terrain where logistics and adaptability mattered more than prior experience. In every subsequent campaign, from New Georgia to Bougainville to the Philippines, these patterns would repeat. The 6-month campaign for a small jungle-covered island that most Americans couldn't locate on a map in August 1942 had decided the war's trajectory. The Japanese soldiers who confidently watched Marines stumbling ashore on that first day could never have imagined what they were witnessing. They thought they were seeing the arrival of victims who would be quickly crushed by superior Japanese jungle warfare skills. Instead, they were watching the arrival of a military force that would learn faster, adapt better, and fight harder than Japanese doctrine said was possible. Within 6 months, the jungle that was supposed to be Japan's greatest advantage had become a graveyard where the myth of Japanese invincibility died alongside 20,000 soldiers who starved and sickened because American naval power and logistic superiority had turned Guadalcanal into an inescapable trap. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, who had watched with contempt as Marines came ashore in August, was among the fortunate 10,000 evacuated in February. Weighing barely 90 pounds, ravaged by malaria and dysentery, he huddled in the hull of a destroyer as it raced north through waters the Imperial Navy no longer controlled. Around him, other survivors sat in shell-shocked silence, too weak to speak, too traumatized to process what they'd endured. They were the lucky ones. They'd survived 6 months in hell, but they carried with them the knowledge that would poison Japanese morale for the rest of the war. The Americans weren't soft. The jungle wasn't Japan's ally, and courage without logistics was just a slow way to die. The myth of Japanese jungle warfare superiority had died on Guadalcanal, killed not by bullets, but by the terrible reality of starvation, disease, and an enemy that had learned to be just as hard as the environment that was supposed to defeat them.